She drove her SUV through his front door. Why did a beauty queen pull the trigger? Betty Broderick's confession echoes unanswered.
The street was quiet. It was the early morning of Sunday, November 5, 1989, in Marston Hills, an affluent and peaceful neighborhood in San Diego. The sprawling colonial house at 1041 Cypress Avenue sat behind manicured lawns and heavy wooden doors. From the sidewalk, there was no sign of a disturbance. The exterior security lights were off. The alarm system had not been triggered. There were no broken windows and no forced locks. But inside the master bedroom on the second floor, a violent scene was waiting for investigators. Two bodies lay on the bed. A 44-year-old man and his 28-year-old wife. On the carpet near the bed, a heavy telephone receiver rested in silence. It had not just been dropped. The cord had been physically ripped out of the wall jack. The weapon, a 5-shot, .38 caliber revolver, was nowhere to be found in the room. The initial visual evidence suggested an execution by a professional, someone who knew how to bypass security and navigate a massive house in the dark.
Wait, if the alarm was completely bypassed and there was no forced entry, this was not a random break-in. The killer had a key.
The killer had a key. And the killer was not a professional. She was a prominent La Jolla socialite, the mother of the man's 4 children, and the former president of a local medical auxiliary. She did not run away. She did not try to board a flight or hide the weapon. Instead, she drove back to her own home, picked up the phone, called her daughter, and confessed to the shooting. Her name was Elizabeth Broderick, known to everyone as Betty. But this case would not be a simple open-and-shut murder investigation. The question that would consume the American legal system for the next 2 years was not who pulled the trigger. The question was whether the law could recognize the deep psychological fractures that drove her up those stairs.
If she confessed immediately, what was left for the legal system to debate? Did she claim it was an accident?
She claimed it was a tragedy born of severe psychological abuse. To understand how a respected suburban mother ended up standing in the dark with a revolver, investigators had to look backward. Betty and Dan Broderick met in the 1960s. They were an ambitious, driven couple. Betty worked tirelessly to support Dan while he completed a medical degree at Cornell University, and then a law degree at Harvard. She raised their children, managed their heavily restricted finances, and sacrificed her own career so Dan could become a dual-qualified powerhouse. And that sacrifice paid off. The family moved to San Diego, where Dan established a highly lucrative practice specializing in medical malpractice. He became a superstar in the legal community. They joined country clubs, bought a massive estate, and lived the pinnacle of Southern California high society. But the balance of power in their marriage had quietly shifted. Dan held all the financial and social capital.
That is a dangerous dynamic. She built the foundation he stood on, but once they had money, he held all the control.
Exactly. And that control became a weapon in 1983. Dan hired a 21-year-old former flight attendant named Linda Kolkena to be his legal assistant. Linda was widely described in the press as glamorous and strikingly beautiful. Betty quickly suspected an affair. For over 2 years, Dan flatly denied it. He told Betty she was crazy. He called her paranoid, old, and unstable. He actively gaslit her, insisting her suspicions were just symptoms of mental illness. Betty was trapped in a reality where she knew her marriage was ending, but her husband refused to admit the truth, instead attacking her sanity. Finally, in 1985, Dan moved out and admitted the affair was real. He filed for divorce. But this was not a normal divorce. Dan Broderick was the president of the San Diego Bar Association. He knew every judge, every loophole, and every pressure point in the family court system.
So he is litigating against a woman who has no legal training, using the system he controls to dictate the terms of the split.
He did more than dictate the terms. He isolated her entirely. Dan used his legal expertise to secure a unilateral emergency court order, giving him full custody of their children. He sold their house out from under her against her wishes. Because Betty had signed legal documents years earlier trusting her husband, she found herself financially paralyzed. Dan was earning more than $1 million a year, but he tightly controlled Betty's monthly support, leaving her desperate and panicked. He tied her up in endless legal motions. Betty began to spiral. She retaliated in ways that destroyed her own credibility. She broke into his new house and smeared a Boston cream pie all over his bed and clothes. She left hundreds of obscene, furious voicemails on his answering machine. She even drove her heavy Chevrolet Suburban straight through the front door of Dan's house.
Wait, hold on. She drove a vehicle into his house? That is a massive escalation. That crosses the line from a bitter divorce to severe physical danger.
It was a massive escalation, and it gave Dan exactly what he needed legally. He used the property damage and the voicemails to obtain a restraining order. He even started fining her. Dan created a system where he would deduct $100 from her monthly support check for every profane word she left on his answering machine, and thousands of dollars for every unannounced visit. He essentially treated her like a hostile corporation, sanctioning her into submission. Betty was stripped of her children, her home, her social standing, and her financial security. By the spring of 1989, Dan and Linda officially married. Betty, feeling entirely cornered by the legal system, purchased a 5-shot, .38 caliber revolver.
Did she buy the gun legally? Because a woman with documented restraining orders and a history of driving a car into a house should have raised red flags.
She bought it legally. In 1989, the background check systems were not as integrated as they are today, and the restraining orders did not block the purchase. The timeline of the descent ends on November 5th. Betty woke up early. She drove to the house on Cypress Avenue. She did not break a window. She used a key she had secretly taken from her daughter's purse. Betty entered the house in the dark, walked up the stairs, and entered the master bedroom. According to the forensic reconstruction, she stood near the bed and fired 5 shots in rapid succession. The ballistic evidence told a chaotic story. 2 bullets hit the wall. 1 bullet hit a wooden nightstand. But 2 bullets found their targets. Linda was struck in the neck and the chest. The medical examiner concluded she died almost instantly. Dan was struck in the chest. The bullet pierced his lung. According to Betty's later testimony, Dan's final words were, "Okay, you shot me, I am dead."
If 2 shots hit the wall and 1 hit a nightstand, that sounds like she was firing blindly in the dark, not aiming down the sights like an executioner.
That exact point became the foundation of the legal war that followed. After firing the weapon, Betty walked over to the telephone. Dan had fallen to the floor near the phone jack. Betty reached down, pulled the phone cord completely out of the wall, and left the room. She drove away, leaving Dan to bleed to death on the carpet. When the police finally arrested Betty, the district attorney charged her with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began in 1990, and it immediately became a national spectacle. The courtroom became a battleground over the definition of abuse. The prosecution argued that this was a cold, calculated, premeditated double execution motivated by greed and jealousy.
How did prosecutors bridge the gap between a bitter divorce and a calculated double murder? Did they focus on the timeline?
They focused heavily on the timeline and her physical actions. Prosecutors argued that buying the gun months in advance showed long-term intent. Stealing her daughter's key showed planning. Driving to the house before dawn and bypassing the alarm showed stealth. But the most damning piece of evidence for the prosecution was the unplugged telephone. They argued that pulling the phone cord out of the wall while her ex-husband was bleeding on the floor proved malice aforethought. It proved she wanted to ensure he could not call an ambulance. It proved she wanted him to die.
What did the defense say about the phone? Because pulling the cord out of the wall is incredibly hard to explain away as a panic response.
The defense, led by attorney Jack Early, offered a completely different interpretation of the evidence. They argued that Betty did not go to the house to kill Dan and Linda. She testified that she went there to confront them, to force Dan to listen to her, and then to kill herself in front of him. Early argued that Betty was suffering from a profound psychological breakdown caused by years of gaslighting and legal battering. According to Betty, when she entered the dark bedroom, Linda woke up and yelled for Dan to call the police. Betty claimed that Dan lunged toward the nightstand or the phone, and in a sudden wave of panic, she fired the weapon blindly.
Does that actually prove reasonable doubt for murder? Or does it only prove she was highly emotional when she committed the murder?
That was the crucial legal distinction the jury had to make. The defense was not trying to win an acquittal. They were trying to reduce the charge from first-degree murder to voluntary manslaughter. To do that, they had to prove provocation. They had to convince the jury that Dan's years of psychological torture and legal manipulation pushed a normal woman into a state of temporary dissociation. The defense characterized Betty as a battered woman. While she did not suffer physical beatings, experts testified that the psychological isolation and financial terror she endured created the exact same trauma responses seen in physically battered spouses.
Was that forensic psychology accepted in court at the time? Because applying battered woman syndrome to a wealthy socialite who was not physically hit sounds like it would face severe legal resistance.
It faced massive resistance. The prosecution attacked that theory relentlessly. They pointed out that Betty had access to money, friends, and lawyers. They argued she was not a helpless victim, but a narcissist who was enraged that she lost her status and her control over Dan. But the defense strategy worked just enough. After days of deliberation in the first trial, the jury announced they were hopelessly deadlocked. 10 jurors voted for murder. 2 jurors voted for manslaughter. The judge was forced to declare a mistrial.
Wait, a mistrial? 2 jurors believed her story enough to hold out against a murder charge? That is a stunning failure for the prosecution.
It shocked the legal community. The district attorney realized they had allowed the first trial to become an indictment of Dan Broderick's character, rather than a trial about Linda and Dan's murder. For the second trial in 1991, the prosecution changed its strategy entirely. Prosecutor Carrie Wells took over. She systematically stripped away the emotion and focused purely on the mechanics of the crime. The judge in the second trial also changed the rules. The court heavily restricted the defense from introducing vast amounts of evidence regarding Dan's behavior during the divorce. The defense was not allowed to fully explain the extent of the legal abuse.
So the jury in the second trial was looking at a completely different narrative. They were judging her actions on the day of the murder, without the full context of the preceding 5 years.
Exactly. Without the full weight of the psychological context, Betty's actions looked entirely predatory. The prosecution hammered the forensic facts. 5 shots fired, a stolen key, an unplugged phone. Prosecutor Wells painted Betty as a relentless stalker who harassed Dan and Linda for years before finally executing them. The defense again argued for manslaughter, pointing to the scattered bullet trajectory as proof of blind panic rather than cold aiming. But the restricted evidence left Betty exposed. In December 1991, the second jury returned a verdict. They did not find her guilty of first-degree murder, which would have meant they believed she planned the killings long in advance. Instead, they convicted her of 2 counts of second-degree murder.
Second-degree murder means they believed she acted with malice and intent in the moment, but they did not believe she drove to the house with a clear, premeditated plan to kill.
That is how legal experts interpreted the verdict. The jury essentially compromised. They rejected the defense's claim of sudden panic and manslaughter, but they also rejected the prosecution's claim of cold, calculated assassination. Betty Broderick was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. The legal outcome was final, but the cultural aftermath was just beginning. The case violently divided the public. Half the country viewed Betty as a ruthless, entitled killer who murdered 2 sleeping people because she could not accept a divorce. The other half saw her as a tragic victim of a biased family court system, a woman pushed to the brink of insanity by a powerful man who used the law to destroy her.
It is terrifying because it highlights how domestic abuse does not always look like physical violence. Sometimes it looks like legal filings and court orders.
And the tragedy is that the system entirely failed to recognize the escalating danger. The courts treated a rapidly deteriorating mental health crisis as a standard civil dispute. Fines and restraining orders did not de-escalate the tension. They only tightened the spring. Today, Betty Broderick remains in a California prison. She has been denied parole multiple times, largely because parole boards have concluded she still lacks deep remorse and continues to blame Dan for forcing her hand. The house on Cypress Avenue was eventually sold, but the echoes of what happened there remain a haunting reminder that when the law fails to protect the vulnerable from manipulation, the consequences can break the boundaries of reason entirely. If this case left you questioning the boundaries of the legal system and psychological abuse, please subscribe for more deep investigations into cases that still divide the public.
And tell us in the comments what you believe happened in that bedroom. Do you agree with the second-degree murder verdict? Or do you think the years of psychological manipulation should have changed the legal outcome?
If this episode was worth your time, leaving a like helps support the channel and keeps these complicated true crime stories in front of people who still want to understand the truth.
Stay safe and keep questioning everything.